Screw what the ranger said, she snapped. If it was your kid out there, wouldn't you want someone to help? If you find a crying child on the trail, you better not follow them. My girlfriend and I are seasoned hikers. We've tackled everything from rugged mountain trails to swampy, mosquito-infested paths, and we've always made it out unscathed. But this time was different. This time, the trail almost didn't let us go. It started with a warning. I know, that sounds over the top, but it's true. The guy at the ranger station, a wiry, middle-aged man with a leathery face, looked up from his clipboard as we signed in. You two sticking to the main trail? He sounded like he must have smoked 4 packs a day for the last decade. Planning on taking the loop trail up to the summit, I replied. We've been looking into it for a while, and we think the weather's right for it this weekend. We've never been through Baroque Park before, but we've heard it's beautiful. My girlfriend curled her arm through mine and rested her cheek on my shoulder. It's going to be great. I think he might have something special planned for us. I didn't. My smile turned nervous. The ranger hesitated, his pen hovering over the paper. Could he tell I didn't have a ring? Was he about to out me? He braced a hand on the counter and leaned forward, eyes serious beneath bushy eyebrows. Stick to the marked paths, and if you hear anything strange, like a kid crying, you keep walking. Don't stop. Don't look. Just keep going. What? My girlfriend gave a nervous laugh. Don't want you to get lost. The ranger's eyes didn't waver. People go looking for what they shouldn't, and not all of them come back. We decided it was just some backwoods superstition to spook tourists. What else could it be? So after we brushed off the nerves, we shouldered our packs and started up the trail. The first few hours were uneventful. Just the two of us surrounded by towering pines, the crunch of dirt and leaves underfoot, and the occasional bird call. If you've ever been on a hike before, well, there you go. Standard day. My girlfriend kept looking over at me, eyes gone to honey. I didn't know why she thought this was a special proposal trip. It wasn't until we parked I even realized that's where her expectations were set. And my attention? Yeah, I was trying to figure out what I was going to do to cushion the blow when we hit summit. Then we heard it. A child's voice, crying. We stopped dead in our tracks. Amber froze, her eyes wide. Do you hear that? I nodded, my stomach twisting into knots. It sounded like a little girl, maybe 6 or 7 years old. Help me, she was calling out, her voice breaking with sobs. Please help me! Mommy? Daddy? Her voice grew quiet with fear. Anyone? Hello? Are you okay? I called, my voice bouncing off the trees. The crying stopped. For a moment, the forest was silent, too silent. No wind, no birds, nothing. Then the crying started again, louder this time, closer. We need to check it out, Amber said, already stepping off the trail. She waved her arms to the side to keep her balance as she made her way down the incline. Every instinct I had screamed at me to stop her. The ranger said, "Screw what the ranger said," she snapped. If it was your kid out there, wouldn't you want someone to help? She had a point. Against my better judgment, I followed her down the incline and into the trees. The crying led us deeper into the woods. Help me! Someone, please! She sounded frantic, but the further we went, the more I noticed something was off. The voice wasn't changing direction. Normally, if someone's lost, their voice shifts as they move or turn their head. But this sound, it was static, like it was coming from a fixed point. The ranger's warning came back to mind. My steps started to slow down. Amber, I think we should go back. Something's not right. I can't find you. Please, I'm scared. The kid was sobbing now. Stop acting like a jerk, Amber snapped. She's got to be right ahead of us. Amber was right. 20 more feet and we saw her. She was sitting on a fallen log, her back to us, wearing a dirty pink jacket and clutching her knees to her chest. Hey, sweetie, Amber called gently, stepping closer. Are you lost? Where are your parents? The girl didn't answer. She just kept crying, her shoulders shaking with each sob. Please help me. Amber crouched down, reaching out to touch her shoulder. Wait, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Something about this felt wrong. Why was she just sitting there? When Amber had called for her, why hadn't she tried to find us? Amber, we should just go get the ranger. Come on. The girl's crying stopped. In one smooth, jerky motion, she turned to face us. Her eyes weren't right. They were too large, too dark, reflecting the light like an animal's. You found me! Her mouth stretched wide into a grin that split her face unnaturally, revealing rows of sharp, needle-like teeth. I knew you would. I knew if I called for you, you would find me. Then her skin, her entire skin, began to split down the middle like a zipper. I don't know what I was expecting to see underneath, but it wasn't this. It wasn't the sinewy, raw-looking creature that crawled out of its human shell like a spider shedding its exoskeleton. Amber screamed, stumbling backward. I grabbed her arm, yanking her to her feet, shouting, "Run!" So loudly it made my throat sting. We bolted, crashing through the underbrush, branches whipping at our faces. Behind us, I heard the creature give a low, guttural growl, followed by the unmistakable sound of something running. Fast. It was chasing us. We hit the incline, then the trail, and didn't stop running until we burst back into the ranger station, gasping for air. The ranger looked up from his desk, his face grim. You heard it, didn't you? We nodded, too shaken to speak. He sighed, getting up and locking the door. You're lucky you ran. Most people don't. We didn't ask what he meant. We didn't want to know. We've hiked dozens of trails since that day, but we've never gone back to that forest. And if we ever hear crying in the woods again, we'll keep walking. They want me dead, and I don't blame them. The knife came out of nowhere. One minute I was ordering a slice of cake from the waiter, the next there was a flash of silver. My brain registered that the waiter had whipped out a knife only after I had automatically recoiled from him, sliding further into the booth. Without conscious thought, I picked up and flicked the steaming cup of coffee at his face. The knife slashed past my face, missing my eye by a hair's breadth. I thought I saw an eyelash fall. The waiter screamed as the brown liquid plastered his face and dropped the knife. I stared wildly around. There were only 2 other guests in the diner. They seemed rooted to their seats. A chef stood at the kitchen window, frozen mid-plating, garnish still in hand. None of them seemed to be in any hurry to help. I was trapped in the booth by the window and had the option of trying to climb over the high-backed seats to the booth behind or to clamber over the table to make a leap to the next booth in front. The waiter stopped clawing at his face in those short seconds. He flailed his arms out at me as I sprung up onto the seats. He missed, and I yelped as I leapt onto the table, then attempted to springboard past him. Still half-blinded, the waiter turned and grabbed something off the ground. The knife. Damn it. He swung back around, and I prepared myself to leap from his reach. A shot rang out, accompanied by the shattering of glass. I ducked, falling to my knees. I swiveled my head, desperately trying to spot where the shot had come from. There was a thud by my side. The waiter had collapsed to the ground. The back of his head was a clumpy red and gray mess. An acrid, metallic scent, tinged with gunpowder, enveloped the place. Screams. It took me a while to realize I was a contributing instrument to the symphony of screams. The police arrived shortly after. They didn't know who had shot my assailant. I certainly didn't have a gun on me, and had 3 witnesses to vouch for my innocence. They assumed a passerby had intervened and run, for fear of repercussions for shooting a man dead, justifiable or not. No one on the streets witnessed the shooting, or so they said, when asked by the police. I think I puked at some point. I don't think I'll ever forget the way the gooey, lumpy substance had trickled out his head and down the sides of his body. The police had no idea why he had attacked me, what my would-be murderer's motivations were. They didn't even know who the waiter was. He had apparently appeared out of nowhere with a fake identity and taken the job as waiter just a few days before I dropped in for my usual coffee and cake breakfast. I didn't leave my house for 2 days. When I finally did, it was for a crisis at work. Something I had to personally deal with. I was terrified the whole journey. Every little thing made me jump. I made sure to mind my own business and kept my eyes averted from others. I was almost at the entrance to my office building when a car pulled up next to me. I was so relieved at finally reaching my destination that I didn't notice the window in the passenger side wind down, didn't notice the gun pointed straight at me, didn't see the face of the person holding the gun. Not until another car rammed into the back of that car, and the shot went wide. As the bullet struck the concrete wall behind me, missing my head by a couple of inches, I stared straight at the shooter. Their face was covered by a mask, one of those cheap white masks with eye holes that you could buy at any party store. I saw them curse, then turn to aim the gun at me for another shot. Their head exploded. One moment I was looking into hard eyes gleaming through the white mask. Next there was a headless neck perched on lifeless shoulders, blood splattered all over the dashboard and seats. The body slumped forward. I found myself joining in the cacophony of screaming once again. Before I could recover my wits, someone grabbed me from behind, and a cloth was pressed over my mouth and nose. I struggled as they dragged me to the car, the one that had rammed into the first car and ended up saving my life. Can you please subscribe? Thank you. They hadn't even slammed the door shut after me when I passed out. I awoke to darkness. I was still in a state too groggy, too out of it to panic, when I heard a voice. The odd robotic timbre made it clear a modulator was being used. You need to stay here. It's to keep you safe. It's just for a short while. I didn't respond. My tongue felt swollen and dry, like a dust ball had enveloped it. We will not harm you. It's our duty to keep you safe. That was all that was said. I raised my head off the ground and sat up. I was relieved to find that I wasn't bound or tied. Who the hell could have done this? They said they were keeping me safe, but they had basically kidnapped me. But who would kidnap me? Was it one of my recent one-night stands? Did I offend anyone on a date? Was it a bitter work colleague, an angry ex? I couldn't think of anyone I could possibly have offended enough to be kidnapped for, or attacked at knife and gunpoint for that matter. Minutes passed in the unlit room, then hours. The darkness was absolute, the silence unyielding, punctuated only by my panicked breaths. The air was stale, a mix of sweat, earth, and disinfectant. Respite from the isolation came only in brief interludes whenever I was fed. A little rectangle of light would appear at the door, followed by a tray of food slid through to me. I refused to eat food I could not see, and so they would turn on the lights for 5 minutes while I ate. There was a loo in the room which I could freely use, though the darkness made it hard to navigate. I tried to go only when the light was still on. Besides the meals, nothing. At some point, at my desperate pleas, they said I would be released in a matter of days. But time in that dark room stretched endlessly. The wait between meals felt like forever. It's surprising how agonizingly slow time passes when you have nothing to engage your mind with. No phones, no books, no chatter, nothing. I began to suspect they were torturing me in some sick psychological way. I began to wonder if that was it, for the rest of my life, trapped in darkness, alone. When nothing changed after the 9th meal, I counted, I ignored the 10th meal. I stayed unmoving, ignoring the lights and the tray that slid into the room. I didn't bother to slide the tray out when instructed to. By the 15th meal that I had ignored, I heard voices outside the door. I pretended to be fast asleep and didn't stir. It was easy to lay still. I had barely moved since I started skipping meals. I was consumed by hunger and thirst. All I could think about was a tall glass of iced lemonade and eating peanut butter from the jar. "We need to let her go," I heard someone say. It wasn't in the modulated voice. It sounded like a woman. "She's not eating. She could die at this rate. She's been passed out for the last half a day." "It's not safe yet," a man's voice responded. "We haven't caught all of them." "It's one guy. One guy escaped. He's probably busy fleeing, and we've locked down their time door." "You think there aren't others? For fuck's sake, she's the butcher's mother. There's gonna be others keen to end her." The exasperation was clear in the man's voice. "But we've stopped the only group with access to a time door," the woman snapped. "What do you need to lock her up for years as we hunt down every single person who might try to take her out?" "We might as well end her ourselves," the woman snapped. "Would that be so bad? It would save hundreds of lives," the man asked. "Stop it. She's innocent. She's not her son. And it's our job to keep the timeline intact. We cannot let history change. You know what could happen." "She did produce a monster," the man retorted. Then he sighed. "I get it, okay? I know my duty. It's just, I see why they're trying." There was silence after that. I was left alone once again, except for the meals I ignored. I was finally certain. I had been kidnapped by a bunch of crazies. I had no son, and was a proud, card-carrying member of the Child-Free Club. I ignored 3 more meals before I heard their voices once again. This time through the modulator. I could barely focus through the fog of deprivation. "The door will be unlocked in 10 minutes. You will be free to leave then." I didn't speak. I didn't trust them. It could all be a cruel joke to give me false hope. Others will be coming for you, the voice spoke again. You have to be very careful. Take all precautions to stay safe. That was all. A while later, there was a click at the door. I struggled to my feet and almost passed out when static encroached my vision. I pushed past the weakness and dizziness and made my way to the door. To my immense relief, it opened when I twisted the knob. I won't bore you with details of how I made it home, but I made it home safe and made a police report once I had choked down some food and water. No one tells you how much difficulty, how much stomach-twisting pain you would feel eating and drinking again after days of fasting. I sure as hell never tried to fast before and never will again. The police were, once again, useless. I directed them to where I had been held, but they gleaned nothing from the room or the surrounding area. There was not a single evidence or clue to be found. They concluded that I had been kidnapped by a bunch of mentally unwell people, and that they were also behind the attacks. The officers told me they would be in touch once they had more to go on, and that my house would be under surveillance for my protection. I would also be escorted to work for the foreseeable future. I took a week off work to recover from the whole ordeal. Or try to, at least. It was a mind screw, to say the least. I couldn't make sense of anything that had happened. Even in the safety of my home, I was drowning in fear. Every little sound made me start and reach for my baseball bat. My period of starvation also made it hard for me to consume food and drinks again. I puked several times when I tried to eat, and it was hard for me to keep water down. It was only after a fourth morning of nausea when I called the officers parked in front of my house to escort me to the convenience store. I needed to be sure. Once I was alone in the house with my purchase, the officers back to surveillance duties, I peed on the stick I bought. The 3 minutes took forever to go by. There it was, a bold line and a second faint line. My girlfriend talks in her sleep. Last night she told me where the bodies are. If I'm being honest, I ignored the warning signs. I mean, wouldn't you? Sharon was perfect, or at least she seemed perfect at the time. She's beautiful in that classic way that makes people stop and stare. Smart too. She's got a dry sense of humor that could cut glass, and she knows exactly how to use it. We've been dating for 8 months now. And yeah, maybe it was a little fast, but everything just clicked. From our first date, I knew I wanted her in my life. She felt like the total package, someone I could actually see myself building a future with. Looking back, there were little things I should have paid more attention to. It started on our 4th date. We were sitting on her couch drinking wine when she brought it up. I should probably warn you about something, she said, swirling her glass. I raised an eyebrow, already half in love with her. Oh? What's that? I'm not the easiest person to sleep next to, she said. I laughed, thinking she was making a joke. Don't worry, I've shared a bed with snorers before. I think I can handle it. She shook her head, a small smile playing on her lips. It's not just snoring. I talk in my sleep. Sometimes I move around well, I've even been known to slap people by accident. Slap people, huh? Sounds like an occupational hazard, I teased. She gave me this look, half serious, half amused. I'm just saying, it's happened before. If you decide to stick around, you've been warned. At the time, I didn't think much of it. It sounded harmless, even kind of cute. But looking back, yeah, I should have taken her more seriously. The first time I stayed over at her place, I was anticipating a slap in my sleep just so I could poke fun at her about it the next morning. But for the most part, that first night was uneventful. She tossed and turned a little, muttering what sounded like random gibberish. Not the red one, and don't let it fall. I barely noticed. Over the next few weeks, her quirks started to come out more. One night, I woke up to her hand smacking me squarely in the chest. What the hell? I mumbled, groggy and confused. Sharon was still asleep, her arm falling limp against the bed. The next morning, I brought it up over breakfast. So, you hit me last night. She almost choked on her coffee, her eyes wide with mock horror. I did. Yup, full-on smack. Guess you were dreaming about fighting someone. She grinned, shaking her head. Maybe I was dreaming about Aaron. Aaron was her ex-husband. She didn't talk about him much, but from what I gathered, their divorce had been messy. The way she said his name, half joking, half bitter, made me wonder if there was more to the story. Still, I laughed it off. At the time, it didn't seem like a big deal. The warnings kept coming, however, in subtle ways I didn't recognize for what they were. A few weeks into staying over, Sharon brought it up again one night as we got into bed. I wasn't kidding about the sleep stuff, you know, she said. I know, I replied, pulling the covers over us. Honestly, it's not that bad. It's sort of adorable. Her smile faltered for just a second. Just don't freak out if I say something weird, okay? I gave her hand a reassuring squeeze. Sharon, it's no trouble, really. I think you're perfect, and nothing you say in your sleep is going to change that. She smiled again, but this time it didn't quite reach her eyes. At the time, I thought it was nothing. Now I wish I'd taken that moment more seriously. The first few weeks of staying at Sharon's place were normal enough. Sure, she moved a lot in her sleep, tossing, turning, even mumbling, but I figured it was just part of her quirky charm. But then her topics of conversation changed dramatically. At first, she'd say things like, "Put that down," or "Get the cat," harmless nonsense, and I'd laugh about it the next morning. But one night, about a month in, I woke up to something different. "It's under the oak tree," Sharon murmured, her voice low and steady. I blinked, groggy and confused. "Sharon?" She didn't respond. Her body was still, her breathing slow and even. I sat up and leaned closer. "What's under the oak tree?" Nothing. She didn't say anything else, just rolled over and pulled the blanket tighter around herself. The next morning, over breakfast, I brought it up. "You said something weird in your sleep last night," I told her. Sharon raised an eyebrow, sipping her coffee. "Oh yeah? What did I say?" "It was strange. You said, 'It's under the oak tree.'" She tilted her head like she was trying to figure out if I was joking. "Huh, that's weird. Maybe it was about a treehouse or something. Do you remember what you were dreaming about?" She shook her head. "Nope, my dreams are unbelievably random. You know how it is." I nodded, but her answer didn't sit right with me. There was something about the way she brushed it off, too casually, like she was trying to steer the conversation in another direction. A week later, I woke up to her pacing, circling the bed as if she was measuring the room. "Sharon?" I whispered, rubbing my eyes. She didn't answer. I reached for the bedside lamp, but as soon as I touched the switch, she stopped dead in her tracks. "Don't," she said sharply. My hand froze. "Don't what?" She didn't respond. For a moment, she just stood there, then climbed back into bed, her movements stiff and robotic. The next morning, I kept it to myself. I wanted to ask her about what she'd said, but something told me not to. Things got worse after that. One night, she sat straight up in bed and started muttering again. "2 miles from the highway," she said, her voice calm and steady. "It works better when the ground is wet." I didn't even try to wake her this time. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. When she finally rolled over and went quiet, I got up and went to the kitchen. My hands shook as I poured myself a glass of water. What the hell was going on? The breaking point came a few nights later. I woke up to Sharon sitting at the edge of the bed, her back to me. "I told you it wouldn't work," she whispered. I sat up slowly. "Sharon?" She didn't turn around. Her head tilted slightly like she was listening to someone I couldn't see. "He said he'd take care of it, but he didn't. Now it's my problem." "Sharon, who are you talking to?" I asked. She didn't answer. Instead, she stood up and walked out of the bedroom. I didn't follow her. I just sat there, frozen, listening to her footsteps fade down the hall. When I woke up the next morning, she was already in the kitchen, humming to herself as she flipped pancakes. She looked up and smiled when she saw me. "Good morning," she said cheerfully. I forced a smile, but my stomach churned. I couldn't stop thinking about the things she'd said in her sleep. The night I realized something was really wrong started like any other. Sharon fell asleep quickly, curled up on her side, while I stayed awake scrolling on my phone. Everything seemed normal until I heard her voice. At first, I thought she was speaking to me. "I held his nose shut," she said. I froze. Her voice was low, cold, almost monotone. It didn't take long. He kicked for a while, but then he stopped. I turned to her. Sharon was still lying on her side, breathing slowly. "Sharon?" I whispered. She didn't respond. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Dragged him down the embankment. The soil was soft, perfect for digging." "What the hell?" I muttered under my breath. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I confronted her. "You were talking in your sleep again last night." Sharon glanced up from her coffee, looking amused. "Oh, no, really?" What did I say this time? I hope it wasn't anything embarrassing. I hesitated. You said something about suffocating someone and digging a grave." She frowned. That's weird. Maybe a nightmare about one of those crime shows I watch. You know how much Netflix I binge. She laughed, but it didn't feel genuine. You don't remember what you were dreaming about? I pressed. Sharon shook her head. No, sorry. Honestly, Chris, I never remember any of my dreams. I nodded, but I suspected she wasn't telling me everything. A few nights later, I woke up to her voice again. Max, she said. Her tone was calm, detached. I sat up in bed, my skin crawling. He's behind the old barn, she continued. The one with the blue door. The name was familiar. A young man named Max had gone missing years ago while on a camping trip. His case was still unsolved. The next morning, I didn't bring it up. I didn't know how to, but I couldn't get the name, or her words, out of my head. I Googled Max's name on my phone. His disappearance had happened in the next county over. There was no mention in the reports of a barn or a blue door, but the other details Sharon had mentioned matched the description of the area where he'd last been seen. A few days later, I worked up the courage to suggest something to Sharon. She was grinning when I first approached. Have you ever thought about doing a sleep study? I asked carefully. Her smile faded. Why would I do that, Chris? I don't know. Just, you've been saying some really strange things in your sleep. Maybe it's stress or something. I'm fine, she said, shaking her head. You're overthinking it. What about recording it? I said. Just so you can hear it for yourself. Her expression darkened instantly. Number, absolutely not. That's a huge invasion of privacy. I wasn't trying to. If you ever record me without my permission, Chris, we're done. I mean it. Our eyes met, I nodded, and we went on with our day. Inside, however, my world was unraveling. That night, after she fell asleep, I couldn't help myself. I propped my phone under a pillow on her side of the bed and hit record. The next morning, while Sharon was in the shower, I played back the audio file. At first, it was just static. Then, around 2 a.m., her voice came through, clear as day. Nina screamed too much, Sharon murmured. Fast had to move fast. No mistakes. I froze. Nina. I knew her too. A teenager by that name had disappeared 5 years ago, and her case was still open. No, it couldn't be, I thought. This isn't impossible. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had to know if what she was saying was true. That afternoon, I drove to one of the locations Sharon had described, a barn with a blue door. It wasn't far, about 20 minutes outside of town. I found it easily enough. The building was old and weathered, its door faded to a dull gray. Behind the barn was a small grove of trees. The soil beneath them looked disturbed, like someone had dug there recently. I told myself to leave, but I couldn't. I grabbed a nearby stick and started scraping at the dirt. I didn't have to dig for long. The smell, pungent and unmistakable, hit me first. Then I saw it. A torn, dirt-streaked patch of fabric, clinging to what I could only describe as remains. I stumbled back. My head swam as I struggled to process what I was looking at. Sharon hadn't been dreaming. I couldn't stop myself. Every night after Sharon fell asleep, I set up my phone to record. And every morning, while she showered or made coffee, I reviewed what she'd said. It was always the same. She kept crying, so I had to do it fast. It wasn't clean, she'd said. She's in the quarry now. The water keeps her hidden. The names changed, but the pattern didn't. Every night, Sharon whispered something chilling, something specific. Beneath the roots, that's the trick, she'd won one night. No one ever checks beneath the roots. Every morning, I woke up more terrified than the last. The audio files piled up, each one a piece of a horrifying puzzle. I couldn't deny it anymore. These weren't dreams, they were confessions. Sharon started to notice something was off. You've been quiet lately, she said one morning, sliding a plate of scrambled eggs across the table. Just tired, I muttered, avoiding her eyes. You're always tired these days, she said, tilting her head. Is something bothering you? No, I lied. Nothing. She studied me for a moment, her gaze sharp and unblinking, and then smiled. Okay. After that, I felt she watched me more closely, just waiting for me to slip up. One night she caught me. I thought she was asleep. I was sitting on the couch, headphones plugged into my phone, listening to the latest recording. I told him I'd take care of it, Sharon whispered in the recording. But he didn't listen. I had to clean up his mess. The sound of her voice made my skin crawl. What are you doing, Chris? I jumped, yanking the headphones out of my ears. Sharon was standing in the hallway, her arms crossed over her chest. Nothing, I said quickly, locking my phone and shoving it into my pocket. Her eyes narrowed. Were you just listening to something? No, I stammered. I was just scrolling through Instagram. She didn't move. Her expression didn't change. She just stood there, staring at me. Let me see your phone, she said finally. What? I said, laughing nervously. I said, give me your phone, Chris. Why? Because I think you're lying to me. I stood up, trying to keep my voice calm. Sharon, you're being ridiculous. Am I? She said, taking a step closer. You've been acting weird for weeks, avoiding me, locking your phone. What are you hiding? Nothing, I said. Why would you think I... Then let me see it, she said, cutting me off. No. The word came out sharper than I'd intended. Sharon's voice was cold and flat. You recorded me, didn't you? A wave of dread washed over me. I don't know what you're talking about. She took another step forward. While I was sleeping, you recorded me. Admit it. Sharon, Give me the phone, Chris. No. She lunged at me, her fingers clawing for my pocket. I stumbled back, trying to push her away, but she was relentless. Give it to me, she screamed, her voice echoing through the apartment. I twisted out of her grip and ran for the door. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. My hands shook so badly that it took me 3 tries to get the key into the ignition. As I pulled out of the parking lot, I glanced back at the building. Sharon was standing at the window, watching me. I didn't go back for my things, not even my phone. The next day, I logged into my cloud account from a public library computer. The recordings were gone. Sharon must have found a way to delete them. I sat there staring at the empty folder. All the evidence, every scrap of proof, was gone. I didn't go to the police. I couldn't. What was I supposed to say? That my girlfriend confessed to a dozen murders in her sleep? That I found a body exactly where she said it would be? They'd laugh me out of the station. Or worse, they'd think I was involved. And without the recordings, I had nothing but my word. Instead, I did the only thing I could think of. I ran. I drove straight to the next town over, checked into a cheap motel, and spent the rest of the night staring at the cracked ceiling, trying to figure out what the hell I was going to do. The next morning, I bought a new phone with cash. It was nothing fancy, just a basic model that could make calls and access my cloud account. Not that it mattered. The recordings had vanished. Every file I'd backed up had been erased. She'd found a way to delete them. For weeks, I stayed in the motel, keeping my head down and jumping at every sound outside my door. I just knew Sharon was out there, watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. I avoided social media, too afraid she would use it to track me down. The only thing I kept up with was the news. Every morning, I scrolled through local crime reports, praying I wouldn't see her name, or worse, hear that another body had been discovered. At first, there was nothing. No missing persons or disappearances, no murders. For a moment, I let myself believe that maybe I'd scared her enough to stop. Then, the killings started again. It was small things at first. A man found strangled in his home. A woman's body pulled from a lake. Both in neighboring counties, the circumstances eerily similar to the stories Sharon had whispered in her sleep. I told myself it was just a coincidence. It had to be. But then it got closer. A teenage girl went missing from my hometown. Her bike found abandoned on the side of the road just a mile from where I grew up. A week later, her body was discovered in a shallow grave beneath a grove of trees. I couldn't breathe when I saw the report. The site matched Sharon's description exactly. Beneath the roots, that's the trick. No one ever checks beneath the roots. It was her. It had to be. The breaking point came when the news reported another victim, my cousin, Riley. Riley and I weren't close, not anymore, but we'd grown up together. She was the kind of person who lit up every room she walked into, always smiling and laughing. When I saw her name on the news feed, I felt like the floor had been ripped out from under me. The reporter said she'd been found near the same grove where the teenager's body had been discovered. They didn't give any details, but I already knew what they weren't saying. I knew it was Sharon. For days, I couldn't eat or sleep. All I could think about was Riley, how I could have stopped this if I'd done something sooner. If I'd gone to the police or told anyone about what Sharon had said. But I hadn't. I'd run away like a coward, and now Riley was dead. The guilt was suffocating. I've made a lot of mistakes in my life, but running away from Sharon has to be the worst. I thought leaving would save me. I thought it would keep her from finding out how much I knew. But the truth is, it didn't save Riley. It didn't save anyone. I can't keep this to myself anymore. I don't care if no one believes me, or if people think I'm crazy. Even if it put a target on my back, I have to tell someone, have to do something. For days, I've sat here trying to find the right words, words that might make someone believe me, words that might stop her. But the truth is, I don't think it matters anymore. Riley is dead, and it's my fault. I can't stop seeing her face on the news. I can't stop hearing my mom's voice on the phone, shaking as she told me what happened. I could have done something. I could have stopped Sharon. But I didn't. I ran. My hands are shaking, my head is pounding, and my chest feels tight. But I have to get it out. I just need someone to know. Her name is Sharon. She's smart, beautiful, perfect on the outside, and she's a murderer. She's confessed to everything. Max, Nina, all of them. She described how she did it, where she buried them. I thought it was just dreams at first. God, I wanted to believe it was just dreams, but I found one of them. I dug where she said to dig, and there he was. I tried running. I thought if I stayed quiet, she'd let me go. But the killings never stopped. I suppose I want someone to know the truth before she finds me. Because she will. It's just a matter of time. There's a noise. I freeze, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. I hear the sound of glass breaking, of footsteps slow and steady coming from the kitchen. A wave of nausea overwhelms me. I grab the gun from my nightstand, my hands trembling so badly I nearly drop it. Oh God, she's here. I don't know if I'll make it out of this. If I disappear, you'll know why. If anyone finds this, please, don't let her get away with it. I think my teacher might be a serial killer. It started when my English lit professor told me to talk with him after class. I remember his hazel eyes boring into my soul when he asked me that, his wavy dark hair gently caressing the sides of his head. If it sounds like I had a crush on this guy, I did. Professor Fine was only 3 years older than me, a brand new addition to the King's Head campus. I took his class because I needed an easy English credit, but I stayed because I fell madly in love with him. I suspect many of his students felt the same, as the majority were glued to his every word. He had just sent out his first big assignment, what we did over the summer. As a fun little test of our budding prose, I wrote about the wild animal that terrorized our neighborhood, but was vanquished by one brave little dog. When he asked me to stay after class, I suspected he wanted to congratulate me on my amazing story, and would maybe even like to discuss it over dinner? Perhaps just the two of us? I eagerly waited in my seat, feeling the jealous eyes of my classmates drive daggers into my heart. Mr. Fine stood at the back wall, a polite smile on his face as he nodded at the leaving masses. He even shook a few hands like he was a politician or something. He wore a thin brown overcoat with a white shirt underneath. He had a slender frame. I imagine he worked out a lot after class. He was tall as well, almost reaching 7 feet. He would dwarf me just by standing next to me, which I found amusing to say the least. Soon it was just the two of us. I could feel the romantic tension in the air. In hindsight, I think I was projecting pretty heavily. He let out a deep sigh and strode over to me, reaching into his coat. Was it a flower, a love note, some other romantic gesture I can't think of? He pulled out my paper and smacked in onto my desk. That's when he looked dead into my eyes and said the magic words. I am very disappointed in this, Abby May. Wait, what? He noticed my scowl of confusion and continued. The assignment was what you did over the summer, not what you did in Fantasyland. Your style is also very generic, I have to say, riddled with contractions and self-inserting. He went on and on to say that while the scenario was intriguing, he felt it had missed the mark entirely. He said I had potential, but right now I was painfully mediocre. I was stunned, to say the least. Each word felt like he was bashing me in the head with a brick. I slumped over in my seat, on the verge of tears, frankly. It did happen, I said softly amongst his criticism. He shook his head once more. Look, I'm being too harsh here, but only because I think you have the potential. You're a very creative girl, Abby May, but this? He spoke. It's just silly. He went on to tell me he would expect a rewrite within a week, and it was okay if it was boring. After that, I dreaded going to Professor Fine's class. At every turn, he barked down my ideas and pushed me towards realistic standards with my essays. It was odd to me, an English professor so obsessed with realism and a disdain for something out there. I wasn't the only one in the class struggling with that, but I was his star pupil in mediocrity. I thought about complaining to the dean about him, but he wasn't inappropriate or anything like that. He was just a dick. There were a golden few he would lavish praise onto, and let me tell you, these people were dull. I mean, I know it is mean to say, but Jessica's first essay, it was literally titled, "I went to the mall and bought a new dress." It was just 5 pages of her talking about a dress, some silk strap-on eyesore, and she just went on and on and on. She used the word delicious to describe the thing 7 times, yet Fine couldn't get enough of her. He praised her writing as the best in the class, and she tried to play coy, blushing and giggling and waving her dye job hair around like she owed the place. Was I jealous? Yes, of course. Fine had given me the ick, but a crush is hard to get over sometimes. Which is why one can understand when I saw Jessica and Fine having lunch off campus the other day. Well, I just had to follow them. I had just left CVS to pick up some stuff when I eyed Fine and Jessica walking into some fancy Italian place. My heart skipped a beat as I noticed them, hand in hand. Fine has a smile on his face that could tame a lioness, and Jessica fit the bill perfectly. In my stupor, I was nearly run over by someone, and I jumped off the side off the road. I still don't know why I did this outside of some petty whim, but after a moment, I had snuck into the belly of the beast. I sat in the back corner, massive menu in hand as I peeked over it, eyeing the happy couple sitting about 7 tables away. A well-dressed waiter had already brought a bottle for the table. It looked red and expensive. I could make out a painting of a beautiful grape orchid on the label. Fine took the man's hand with a quick wink and a sly shake. The waiter came away and glanced at his hand, nodding at Fine. Jessica seemed impressed by this power move. Frankly, I thought it was a bit cliché. I stalked them for about an hour. They made pleasant dinner conversation and gorged themselves on salad and pasta. I ordered a meatball sandwich to keep my cover, my eyes still glued to them. What did Jessica have that enchanted him so? Her latest essay was about a dog she saw last week. It was 2 paragraphs long. All it did was wax and moan about she had wanted a dog but settled for a cat. The poor cat. Fine had said in front of the whole class that it had nearly brought him to tears. All that gushing made me want to dry heave. It occurred to me then that perhaps Fine was lying and even had ulterior motives. I was overjoyed at the fact that he might have been a secret sleaze. It didn't mean I wasn't a shitty writer. All it meant was he didn't find me attractive. What a dick. The check came and Fine coped a feel as he helped Jessica out of the chair. Her giggling would drive most men to madness. It grated on my ears like someone was driving nails into my head. I winced as the pair left the restaurant. I took out some change from my wallet and skipped out of there, following them some more. I stayed behind them on a snail's pace, darting behind cover like I was a spy on a mission. They didn't seem to come here in a car, and it was getting late. The evening sky enveloped the world above like an old friend. Fine quickened his pace, grabbing Jessica's shoulder as they turned a corner. I followed them just long enough to see that they had walked into a shady hotel. It was 2 stories tall and had cracked lime pane covering it. A man sat by the front entrance on a shitty plastic chair. He had a burly mustache and wore a floral shirt. Fine, and Jessica skirted past the watch guy, who nodded in their direction, barely acknowledging them. This was a strange sight indeed. How long had this place even been here? Kinghead was a college town, barely any crime or anything like that outside the occasional drunken spat between frat bros. Seeing this unsightly building made my skin crawl, and I couldn't quite place the reason why. I crept towards the motel like a cat, tiptoeing in the early night air. It had finally begun to cool up north. The crisp air pecked at my throat like icy shards of glass. I had almost made it inside when the guy at the door stuck his foot out. "Haven't seen you around here, hombre," the man said in a gruff accent. He barely looked at me. I could see now he had a small book in his hand. "Just wanted to check in. Need a break, you know." "You working? Doc gets a cut if you're using one of the rooms here," he explained. A knot formed in my stomach as the sleazy realization hit me. It suddenly hit me. I was very much alone in a seedy part of town. I could feel steam pouring out of my beet red face as I stammered and tried to get away from the doorman. "No, not really like that. Cool if you are, but not really my thing," I explained, backing away. Now the man looked up, eyeing me like a slab of veal. "Too bad. A lot of guys dig on the red." He flashed me a perverted grin as I held down my lunch. "You want a room? It's $80 a night. Check out at dawn. I'm Jorge. I'm the keeper." He flashed his teeth at me, and I could make out at least 3 missing among his rotten set. You aren't the doc, I said dismissively, my sense starting to return to me. Honestly, as I am writing this, I am just coming across as a crazy stalker with a weird crush. It's not a good look, I'll admit that. I was getting ready just to wash my hands of the whole embarrassing affair when Jorge, the keeper, spoke up. Nah, this here is Doc Fine's place. Inherited it from his folks. Seen better days, I know. Jorge grimaced. My heart skipped a beat at that. The hell was a college professor doing owning some rundown motel, let alone brining one of his students to it? If you want to talk to him, you'll have to wait. He's, entertaining, Jorge crookedly said. A wave of disgust hit me like a tsunami. That knot in my stomach was doing backflips now. I was about to speak up when I heard a loud yelp echo out from inside the building. Jorge turned to meet it and then gave me the side eye. See what I mean? I rushed past him as he called back to me, but I was in raider mode now. The lobby was dank and dry at the same time. The whiff of age-old musk hung in the air. The front desk was clear, and I could see coat racks and file cabinets behind it. I focused and tried to find where that cry had come from when I was met with a harsher shriek. It was coming from the back hall, all the way at the end. I sprinted down it, desperately trying to find the source. I don't know what I thought I was going to do. I had my pen taser on me, but that was about it. I heard a loud crash, like a lamp breaking against the wall from the farthest room on my right. It was shut tight, my feet skittering off the ground as I stopped in front of the unassuming door. I froze in front of it, realizing that honestly I was probably about to make a fool of myself. But that knot was strangling my intestines. I knocked on the door to no response. There was another muffled cry, like someone was struggling to breathe. I heard a whimpered no, and my heart froze as I recognized the voice's owner. I pounded on the door this time and shouted Jessica's name. I was ignored once more, but this time the door creaked open. I could hear better inside, a man grunting and a horrid gagging sound. I peeked in, and my eye widened. Fine was on top of Jessica, shirtless. I could make out scratch marks on his well-toned back. I saw Jessica's face, black eyeliner streaked down as it turned a purple hue. She weakly slapped at Fine's face as she gasped for air, but he would not relent. He tightened his grip around her neck, and I could hear her windpipe start to crush in his grasp. Jessia darted her bloodshot eyes around the room until they landed on me. She raised a hand towards me as her eyes pleaded for help. I leapt back with a gasp and realized what I had to do. I dug around in my pocket for my taser and brought it out. It was thin and cheap, but when you jabbed it into someone, it stung like a son of a bitch. With a breath, I burst into the room and leapt onto Fine and jabbed the taser into his side. The zzz of it rang through the air. Fine barely felt it. He released his grip from Jessica to try and pry me off his back. I was wailing on him, my fists digging into the side of his head like a wild spider monkey. He flexed and pushed me off with a thud. I collapsed to the ground in a heap as Fine stepped off the bed. He was breathing heavily and foaming at the mouth like a rabid wolf. I scrambled towards the door, my back facing the wall. I held up the taser like a loaded gun and aimed it at him. He loomed over me as he took a step towards me. Then he glanced back to Jessica. Her eyes stared blankly at the ceiling, a thin line of blood starting to pool out of her mouth. The knot began stabbing me in the guts, like a sassy woman telling you, "I told you so." It's unfortunate, Abby. You were never supposed to see this side of me. Fine waxed poetically. I backed myself against the door and primed myself to flee, still aiming my shaky hand at him. He took a cautious step closer and I practically hissed at him, jabbing the air with my taser. It may seem barbaric what I did here, but I promise you it all serves a grander purpose. Fine chuckled. Her mind was dull and witless, but her eyes, her beautiful baby blues, not to mention her skin, so pure and porcelain, not a mark on it. Unlike some, he snarled. I pushed myself up, Fine towering over me like a raging bull. Flames of fury danced in his hazel eyes, and he wore the face of a raving loon, yet his tone remained calm and collected. Stay back, or I swear I'll jam this thing so far down your throat you'll light up like a Christmas tree, I commanded. He chortled at this, my half-naked teacher. Such an imaginative facade you put on, Abby May. It's why I didn't want to pick you. What part of you could I enjoy? Could I use? The creep leered at me, and I shuddered but held my head fast. I suppose once I'm digging around in there, I'll find something of use. With that, he lunged at me, and I collapsed out the door into the hall with him on top of me. He gnashed his teeth at me like a wild dog, and he tried to wrap his hands around my throat. I could feel his rough hands start to tighten and choke as it became harder and harder to breathe. I gasped out for air as my vision began to blur. All I could see was Fine smiling at me, his deranged face looking down at me as he choked me. No, I wasn't going to die here. Not like this. I used a free hand to search the filthy hotel floor. It smelled like vinegar and shame. Finally, I found my dropped tased and gripped it. With all my remaining strength, I jabbed the taser right in his eye socket. A dull blue light flashed in the hall, and blood spurted onto my face. But I could breathe again. Fine collapsed on the ground next to me. He was screaming in agony. I scrambled to get up and ran down the hall. Jorge the keeper blocked my path, a worried expression on his face when he saw me. I brushed past him at light speed as he scurried over to the wailing half-blind man on the floor. The next few hours were a blur of panic and adrenaline as I went back to my dorm, cell phone in hand. You might be surprised, but I didn't call the cops right away. How would I even explain it to start with? Oh, I was out stalking my teacher and he just happened to kill his date? Even if they believed me, he would have had plenty of time to get rid of the body, and he was missing an eye. He could easily try and turn it around on me like I was a jealous lover or something. I had choke marks, sure, but what would that prove? It would prove I was into kinky shit and became jealous and murdered Jessia and tried to kill Fine. So, I sat there in my bed spiraling for what seemed like hours. My roommate, Barabra, hadn't come back yet. So it was just me sitting there, thumping my foot on the ground and scratching my arm to feel somewhat in control of the situation. As the panic began to wind down, I heard a knock on the door. I froze. Barb wouldn't knock, she had no sense of privacy. I stood up in silence as I tried to remember where I had thrown my taser in my mania. Another knock on the door, less friendly than before. "Who are you?" I called out. "It's Jorge, miss, I'm the keeper." Jorge's voice replied back. It was full of sorrow and uneasiness. "I called the cops, they'll be here any second." I lied. "Please, miss, just open the door. The doc wants to talk to you, clear the air, He clumsily tried to explain. He can explain to the cops. "Miss, we both know you didn't call them," Jorge said plainly. "Otherwise, the doc would already be on the run. He almost ran, had me pack his go bag and everything. But he wants to stay, finish his work. He thinks you might be able to help." My heart burned at the prospect of helping that freak instead of laughing as the cops hauled him in. But I had that gut feeling again, like the only way to catch him was to go with Jorge here. He had said it himself. He was on the verge of running anyway. I failed to save Jessica, even if this was all a cruel thing I had stumbled across. Wasn't it my duty to see it through now? After a moment, I unlocked the door and peeked my head out. There stood Jorge, a gruesome look on his face. I peeked my head out and glanced around. It seemed like he had come alone. Fine then. I have my head on my phone, 911 on speed dial. You guys try anything, it's over. "Señorita, if the doc tries anything," Jorge started. "I'll deal with him myself." He reached into his floral shirt and showed me a holstered pistole. I had that sinking feeling once more, but I just nodded my head and prepared to meet Dr. Fine. I'm posting this now so people know where I am, and if I don't come back, well, hopefully I come back. Maybe it was just a dream. I'm sorry, Grandma. I'll never forget that stare. I would like to make something very clear here. I usually never get scared. When I say never, I truly mean never. I'm a huge fan of horror, but I never felt fear from anything in my life. Mild discomfort at most, but even that's rare. That is until what I experienced 5 minutes ago. It's 5:15 a.m., and I never felt such fear before. For context, I live with my grandma. She just turned 82 last week, and I took time off work to visit and spent time with her in Virginia. I'm 25 and work as a financial analyst in New York. She's raised me all my life and we're extremely close, genuinely the sweetest woman I know. However, the incident I just experienced makes me uncomfortable. Yesterday we were watching TV in the living room, and she was getting a little tired. My grandma is an early bird, so she usually goes to bed at 8:30 to 9 p.m. every night. Tonight was no different. As she got up from the chair she's had since I could remember, she hugged me goodnight and headed upstairs to her bedroom. I'm a night owl and usually don't go to bed until 4:30 to 5 a.m. LOL, so I chose to stay up a bit longer. A few hours passed and I was still watching TV. However, I started hearing a faint banging sound from afar. I couldn't wrap my finger around it, but I ignored it at first. My grandma lives in the middle of the forest in a cabin, so I assumed it was an animal outside scraping for food or something. 5 minutes later, and the banging got a bit louder. The weird thing is that the bangs were consistent, if that makes any sense. I don't know where it was coming from, but it certainly came from outside the house. I started getting a bit concerned when it wasn't stopping, so I went upstairs to check on Grandma. Thankfully, she was fast asleep, and all the windows were locked. By the time I made it to her bedroom, the banging had stopped, so I let it be and walked back down. It was 2 a.m. by this point, and I figured it was time to at least try to go to sleep, since I have insomnia. So I got ready and headed to the guest bedroom, which is where I slept. What felt like a few hours passed, and the banging came back. I hadn't fallen asleep yet, so I could vividly hear the moment it returned. However, this time, it was a little stranger. Not only was it much, much louder, but also, it wasn't just a banging sound. I could also hear screaming coming behind it. A what seemed to be blood-curdling scream of a person yelling for help. The longer I waited, the louder it got. Eventually, I got pissed off and got out of bed. With my phone flashlight at hand, I followed where the bangs and screaming were coming from. But suddenly, just as I had made it to the living room, it had stopped. "TJ, are you okay?" I heard. I turned around and saw my grandma standing on the other side of the hallway. "Yeah, just that I heard a lot of banging and screaming from outside," I replied. "Banging and screaming?" Grandma seemed confused. "Yeah, but maybe it was just an animal or something," I said while dimming the phone flashlight. Although I didn't believe for a second that it was just an animal, I didn't want to make my grandma worried or cause any problems for the night. Besides, it had already stopped, so I hoped that it wouldn't come back. Grandma sighed. "Things like that happen around here sometimes. You should get some sleep, sweetie. It's late and we have plans tomorrow." I smiled. "Yes, Grandma, I will. Love you." I hugged her and went back to my room where I eventually dozed off. I could hear my grandma turning on the TV and cooking herself breakfast as usual. The next day passed by in a flash and nighttime came by again. I hadn't thought of what happened the night before and just saw it as a normal day. That is until I realized that it was 1 a.m. and my grandma was still wide awake. Not just that, but also a lot more talkative than usual too. This wouldn't have caught me off guard if it weren't for the fact that she never stayed up past 9 p.m. for the last 20 years. "Hey, Grandma," I asked. "Shouldn't you go to bed? It's late for you." "Oh, sweetie, but I'm not tired," she said. "I'll go in a bit, don't worry." It was starting to get late, even for my standards. "You should go to bed soon, it's getting late." "I'll go now, good night," I said. As I laid down on my bed, I closed my eyes. After what felt like 15 minutes, I heard that faint sound again. Banging. As it got louder, the blood-curdling scream followed. "What the f***?" I muttered under my breath as I swiftly pushed the duvet off me. Grabbing my flashlight, I went back to investigate. This time, with the intention of figuring out what it was. As I slowly opened the door, I tiptoed around the house, following the sound. It seemed like my grandma was back upstairs, sleeping, so I tried to be as quiet as possible, even though banging and screaming wasn't helping. Although I didn't feel scared of what was happening, like I said, I don't get scared easily. I was getting a bit uncomfortable as the sound worsened the closer I got to it. "What the f***?" I muttered again. As I walked closer, the banging and screaming got progressively louder. Suddenly, I paused. There was no mistaking it. The banging and screaming was coming from the other side of the storage room door, the room my grandma keeps her stuff in. As I reached out to it, I felt a cold presence send shivers down my spine. I gasped and staggered backwards. As I quickly turned around, I saw my grandma standing at the other side of the hallway. But this time, she looked different. Her back, completely straight. Her skin was pale. Her soulless, lifeless stare piercing through me. It was the first time I had seen a human without a single sign of a catchlight shining her eyes. It was a tense and deadly but lifeless expression, one I can't describe in words. However, it was the first time I felt danger looking at the lady who had raised me for 25 years. Her face was glowing from the moonlight outside, although the rest of her body was surrounded by darkness. From afar, it looked like a floating head. Suddenly, her eyes widened, and there followed a smile. However, not a single wrinkle formed around her eyes. It was ominous. Nothing could convince me that the person standing in front of me was my grandmother. It barely felt human. "TJ," she said, her voice toned flat. "What are you doing?" I began shaking. By this point, the screaming had stopped. It was silent. I began stuttering, then stayed quiet. No word escaped from my lips. For the first time in my life, I felt genuine fear. "TJ," repeated my grandma, her voice tone still flat. My body tensed up as I looked at her. I could barely breathe. "What are you doing?" said my grandma, slower than before. I took a deep breath, hoping that any ounce of my body could relax enough so I could form a sentence. "I'm sorry, Grandma," I said, my voice cracking. I was curious on what the screaming was. Grandma's smile dropped instantly, and her eyes widened further. "What scream?" My body tensed again. It felt like I was getting stares from all angles. I suddenly felt something cold touch my bare feet. As I looked down, I saw what looked like blood leaking from the storage room door, reaching to my feet. "Thomas Jr.," said my grandma, raising her voice slightly. I gulped and looked back up. "Yes?" "What scream?" she repeated, her voice deepening slightly. Only one sentence could come out of me at that moment. "Maybe it was just a dream. I'm sorry, Grandma." Her eyes widened further, although her stare only became more tense. "Go to sleep now," she said, enunciating every word. She sounded deeper than before, almost inhumane. "Yes, Grandma," I said, my body tensing up further. As I walked towards her, a sense of pressure dawned over me. Walking past her, I could feel her stare stabbing my head. Walking to my room, I closed the door and hid under the covers. Checking my foot, my suspicions were correct. What I felt leaking from under the storage room door wasn't just water, it was cold blood. This event leads to me writing this down. I don't know what to do. My grandma's stare, if she even was my grandma at that moment, is implanted into my brain. I feel a cold presence looming over me. I'm still shaking, hoping that the morning comes ASAP and I can forget about this. An experimental therapy session promised to change my life. It did, but not how I expected. The opportunity came to me on a rainy afternoon while I was watching a documentary about recovering addicts. I received a pamphlet in my mail that advertised a free week-long therapy session described as innovative and eye-opening, completing with a promise that someone will be returning home feeling a new joy in each aspect of life, as if reborn, whatever that meant. I've been struggling for a long time, and my own therapist had raised his prices far too much for my financial status. A large corner of the paper was dedicated to the head of this event, a middle-aged brunette woman named Dr. Madison, and centered at the bottom were a phone number and email. Looking her and the project up online proved it was in fact real, and that she was a rising figure in her occupation, praised for her unique approach to therapy methods. There were text boxes to fill with the usual personal information and why you were signing up. With nothing to lose, an hour later, I had submitted my application for the project and got a response 2 days later confirming I had been approved and was told the time, date, and location and was instructed to pack some clothes as the entire session would take place in a large room furnished like an apartment. But in reality, we were in a tall corporate building and would be supervised everywhere but the bathrooms. If nothing else, this made me feel safer about having to live with total strangers for a week. I arrived by bus at the building, which was a 5-minute walk from the stop I got off at, where 4 others were already gathered in a circle having a lively chat, all of them neatly dressed, and I instantly recognized Dr. Madison, dressed in a gray suit with hair reaching her shoulders, the other 3 I assumed being my soon-to-be roommates. A young and beautiful girl with short dark hair, dressed considerably more casual than the rest of them. An older woman with visible wrinkles across her face and gray hair tied in a bun, and a rather tall, well-built man whose face muscles seemed to have forgotten how to smile. When I approached them and introduced myself, Dr. Madison welcomed me and gave me a few moments to meet the other participants of the session. The young girl was named Maria, and she gave me a shy smile as I shook her hand. The old lady was much quieter and reserved and only spoke that her name was Amanda, and the man named Ajay already looked like he did not like me. I already made a mental note that all of us obviously had a reason to be here, except for Maria, whose cheery demeanor was not what I expected to see in anyone signing up for experimental therapy. Dr. Madison walked in front of us and ran over the superficial details of the project once more, asking each of us to confirm our participation just as a formality, which I thought was obvious considering we'd already gone far enough as to show up. We entered an elevator that brought us up to the 4th floor, and she showed us to our apartment, which was actually a surprisingly wide room turned into a 4-room apartment with 2 bedrooms, a bathroom, and a living room with the kitchen at the other end. It was surprisingly well furnished, and each of us thanked her for having us. After exchanging those pleasantries, she told us more about the session. Amanda and Maria, you will be sharing that bedroom, and Ajay and Carlos the other one. You have unlimited access to television, books, music, and whatever else you see in this room. You'll be given food 3 times a day, but do not hesitate to press this button by the door to call for us should you need anything else. Every 2 days, the 5 of us will be holding an evaluation, and by then we expect you to have already gotten to know each other enough to share details about your personal lives, be they small or significant. We hope that you enjoy your stay, and I'm very excited to be seeing you soon. Half an hour later, each of us had unpacked and made themselves comfortable in their respective bedrooms. I have to admit that Ajay was not one to talk much, and when he did, I could almost feel how irritated he was that I was trying to get him into a conversation. But in the end, those were Dr. Madison's instructions, and that's why all of us were here. If he didn't want to make an effort, I wasn't going to force him and was just going to turn to Maria or Amanda. Our first proper conversation was during lunch. The staff team brought various meals with and without meat, and careful to make sure that a variety of options was present for any potential allergies. It was impressive to say the least. I thought about how expensive all of this must have been for them, and what they had to get from offering it for free, but it was experimental, I guess. Everyone opened with sharing what they do for work. Maria was a waitress in one of the bigger restaurants in the city, a job she started so she could pay her tuition at university, though she didn't mention what she was studying. Amanda, though retired, ran a large charity I'd heard of, the aim of which was to help the disabled, and Ajay was a police officer. A real shocker, that one. I was the last to speak, telling them I work as a nurse in the private hospital at the edge of town. While we were at the table, I made a few mental notes about each of the 3, like how Maria would always smile and look away when I spoke to her, how AJ was listening more than talking, and how Amanda's hands trembled while trying to bring the spoonful of soup to her mouth. I was worried what they might have seen of me already, and how bad it might just get in the coming days. That evening, the 4 of us collectively decided to enjoy some snacks after dinner in front of the TV and watch a game show. After about an hour, Amanda had gone to bed saying she was exhausted and needed rest, while AJ matter-of-factly stated that he was bored and secluded himself in our bedroom with a book he'd brought himself, leaving me and Maria alone on the couch. Though having met only a few hours ago, I was enamored by her beauty and character, and we must have spent at least an hour and a half getting to know each other before she fell asleep on my shoulder. Her presence calmed me and helped me forget the real reason I was here, if only for mere moments. Maria's family never had a lot of money, and she was mostly providing for herself now, leaving her parents to care for her twin little brothers 2 hours worth of a drive away from here, and that before getting the job she had now, she was working 2 other jobs at the same time. I was happy to hear that she was starting to do better for herself. Not wanting to wake her, I leaned my head back on the couch and was fast asleep soon enough. The second day was rather uneventful, but that's not to say it wasn't going well. I noticed everyone was in a better mood than yesterday, and they were actually talking to each other, sometimes even laughing. I even had the pleasure of being asked a few questions by Ajay, who himself shared that his reason for being here was a scene he'd reported to a while back that left him thinking if he should hand the badge in and find work elsewhere. He didn't elaborate, though, and I decided it was not my place to push him. As for Amanda, I saw her take out a handbag full of medicine, which had my heart drop for a second before she explained that she had to take them at various times of the day for her cancer treatment. She was surprisingly open about it, but still out of respect, I stopped asking questions after that. The meals that second day were much more enjoyable, and we seemed to start finding common ground together despite the age variety, Maria being almost 45 years younger than Amanda. We all stayed up a little later that evening and played a board game accompanied by a glass of wine for each of us, but Amanda, who was adamant we don't pour it away lest we deem her the party killer. Again, after the game ended, only Maria and I remained in the living room, but I was too distracted by what I'd been trying to keep to myself since lunch earlier, and it was that my withdrawal symptoms were beginning to occur. I excused myself and quickly ran off to the bathroom, and then straight to bed, leaving Maria confused and alone in the living room. The third day began with breakfast, and immediately after it, our first evaluation from Dr. Madison. She was dressed elegantly, and accompanying her were 2 men who wouldn't speak and stood beside her on each side as she sat in front of us with a serious look, quite unlike her from what we had seen so far. "Good morning. From what we've seen so far, you've gotten comfortable with each other, that's good." Some of you have began sharing more personal aspects of your lives, and others have been growing close, have you not? She threw a glance towards me and Maria, who was sitting to my right, and then continued. Now it's time for the real treatment to begin. Amanda, why don't you tell everyone here why you signed up for our session? All eyes darted to Amanda, who lifted her eyebrows in surprise and cleared her throat. Well, as I've told them and you already, I'd love to have some support and advise while I am going through my cancer treatment. It can be a lot to deal with for someone on their own. Indeed, it can be. And have you shared with them that most of the money you make from your organization is actually not used to aid the disabled, but in fact goes for your medicine and other treatments? Maria gasped while AJ threw Amanda a dirty look and shook his head. I was shocked too, of course, but I could understand it, to an extent. But why was Madison being so upfront and hostile about this? So you use the money people send you to help those in desperate need to help yourself? They're people just as much as you are. I was taken aback by Maria's sudden blow towards Amanda, and she looked at her with an open jaw and hand to her chest as if pleading innocence, but was interrupted by Madison. Now, Maria, people go to great lengths when they are desperate. And while what Amanda is doing is not right from your point of view, I am sure she can explain it sensibly. Like how you can explain manipulating your customers into leaving you more money, I assume. Her words seemed to pierce Maria's chest, and she was defeated. I thought you'd keep our reasons to yourself, she shouted at her. Yes, none of this will ever leave my mouth to anyone not involved in our project, were my exact words. Confidentiality is a given between us and our patients, which all 4 of you are. Think about it as a version of exposure therapy. Like I said, facing your fears and regrets is one of the first steps to overcoming them, just like you with your opioid addiction, Carlos. My newborn fear had almost instantly come to be as Madison revealed in front of everyone in the room my biggest secret, and I was met with repulsed glances from Amanda, Maria, and Ajay. I had nothing to say and lowered my head. Is that why you've been pacing around and shaking like a damn junkie, Carlos? You're sick, man. Ajay joined in, verbalizing what I assumed to be the thoughts of everyone else. I didn't find the courage to defend myself, because the word he used was exactly how I'd feared I would be perceived. Aggression is not an effective way to deal with any type of trauma, AJ. The last time you resorted to it, the man you were supposed to save died before the ambulance could arrive. Remember? Before Madison could even finish talking, Ajay shot up and sent the chair back, slamming his hands on the table on his way up. You don't know what you're talking about, you bitch. Get me the hell out of this place right now. I'm done. He started making his way to the door and was interrupted by one of the men who placed a hand on his chest and pushed him back. I'm afraid I can't let you or anyone else leave, AJ. You've agreed to staying the entire course of the session, and you have 4 days left to go. 5, if you include today. As Ajay tried to push the man away and leave the room himself, he was immediately apprehended by him and thrown into the table, pushing it away and falling on the floor, all 3 of us jumping back and gasping in response. You can't do this, woman. Let us out now, Amanda ordered in, as demanding of a tone as her voice could bring itself to, but she was met with the same condescending retort from Dr. Madison, who stood up and brought the chair she was sitting on back under the table. During this time, my eyes trailed to the other man still by her side, who'd put a hand behind his back and was looking towards AJ's direction. Like I said, you've agreed to participate until the end of our session. I simply cannot let you leave, even more so when you take into consideration that the results from it will help us learn more about our psychological nature. So this is just some damn experiment, isn't it? Not even a smudge of therapy to be found here, is that it? We're just your little lab rats? I was livid and wanted out as much as the rest of them did, if not more. You may find this very therapeutic in the end, Carlos, if you reach the end. Had she just said, if? Before I could pressure her further on what she meant, the entire room, including Dr. Madison, was shocked when AJ grabbed the man who tackled him and threw him onto the ground when he knelt down to help him back up, punching him and pinning his neck to the floor with his elbow. He seemed to be applying pressure because instantly after the guard began kicking wildly and trying to free himself of his hold. You don't get to decide shit, Madison. I instinctively pushed Amanda and Maria behind me, who were each yelling words I couldn't make out through the rush of adrenaline that had swept over me like a wave. Get us out of here unless... A loud shot rung out and forced everyone on their knees. AJ let out a pained yell and dropped on the floor, the guard he'd kept down taking several deep breaths before getting up and kicking the policeman in the ribs, causing another yelp and making him curl up into a ball even further. I looked towards Madison and the other man who was still keeping his pistol aimed at the injured AJ. She cleared her throat and readjusted herself, pulling on her coat. Acts like these are only going to get you into legal trouble at the end of the session. Don't waste your breaths threatening with lawyers or whatever else you think of. Everything here is government approved. Her gaze turned to the three of us. Your friend will be checked by medical professionals before we bring him back to you, assuming he doesn't cause any more trouble. Ajay was forcefully lifted up by Madison's other guard and basically thrown outside the room, followed by the other two as she spoke once more before the door shut, leaving three terrified people of what might come next.